Okay, thank you very much, Sam, for the introduction and for the invitation. Very pleased to be given the opportunity to talk about my new book, Jane Austen and Vampires. Thank you, all of you, for attending, whether it's over breakfast, dinner, or something in between. Really appreciate you taking the time out to have a listen to what I have to say. Hopefully, it's rewarding. My name's Eric Parisot. I'm from the English department at Flinders University, way down here in Adelaide, Australia. There's my Twitter handle, or X handle as we call it these days. So you're welcome to reach out to me on social media if you like. Today, I'll be offering just an overview of my new book, Jane Austen and Vampires: Love, Sex, and Immortality in the New Millennium. The book ostensibly reads Austen vampire mashups written by fanfic authors to examine why these two literary cults have converged and what this convergence might mean for both the contemporary legacy of Austen and the literary vampire. Now, I'll ask the question that was driving this inquiry from the outset. So why have these two seemingly incongruent literary tastes come together? And now that I've written the book, and I think I know the answer to this question, I'm just going to cut to the chase, and I'll answer it from the outset, and then we can explore some of the texts that I looked at in my study. But three things I think that bring Austen and the vampire together. One is obviously commercial appeal. It's clear that the runaway commercial success of both Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series and Seth Grahame-Smith's Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, as well as their cinematic adaptations, have helped to turn the world of Austen's novels into a Gothic playground. Jane Austen has been paired with sea monsters, aliens, werewolves, ghosts, witches, and even Frankenstein's creature. But her pairing with vampires seems to be the most fertile ground for paranormal fanfic. At the time of writing, I had found almost 30 published Austen vampire mashups, and many more I'm sure are to be found on e-publishing platforms and fanfic sites. Most of them, interestingly, I think, in hindsight, were published between 2009 and 2016. So historically speaking, we're potentially already talking about, well, we are definitely talking about a brief cultural phenomenon, and potentially one that has already passed. This alone seems to suggest that something distinct and unique is or was happening in this creative space. And Twilight and Pride and Prejudice. Now, the second reason, apart from commercial appeal, is the kind of vampire culture turning towards love, towards romance. So you might say that this convergence was made possible by two independent literary trends that have brought vampires and romance together. Now, just a moment ago, Sam and I were talking about James Crawford's Twilight of the Gothic, and he suggests that that convergence of romance and the Gothic over the long durée, it might be considered a return to form rather than something new, and I certainly agree with that. But from the vampire side of things, you might say that the literary vampire has evolved from posing as that ghoul, that sexual fiend, to the sympathetic and sensual Byronic lover, and then more recently as the cherished beloved. This transition is central to what Deborah Dudek calls a new vampire era, a new era in vampire culture, the beloved cycle. The beloved vampire of the new millennium, in Dudek's summation, evolves from the sympathetic vampire, but is marked by a new capacity for, quote, sustained mutual love between a human and a vampire, the kind of love the sympathetic vampire is only capable of fleetingly and or erotically, end quote. From the late 20th century and into the 21st, television series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its spin-off Angel, along with popular paranormal romantic fiction like Charlene Harris's The Southern Vampire Mysteries, L.J. Smith's The Vampire Diaries, and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight, helped to firmly establish a new cycle of vampire literary history, the beloved cycle. So now, in the new millennium, the deep emotional intimacy of romantic love is no longer an exclusively human desire. Thirdly, so we have commercial appeal, the vampires turn to romance, but thirdly, romances turn towards sex. So on the other side of the coin, in romantic fiction, we've seen this palpable turn towards sex and eroticism. Sociological studies surveying and comparing the desires of those who read romantic fiction have shown a reformulation of the relation between love and sex. In the late 70s and early 80s, readers of romance seemed to view sex in romantic fiction in symbolic terms as a symbol or the fulfillment of a loving romantic union. When such surveys were replicated in 2016, the key difference was that readers wanted explicit sexual content. For a start, they wanted their independent but emotionally vulnerable heroines to be sexually liberated, not just the alpha males that they desired. Obviously, this reflects a more open attitude towards female sexuality. Where sex was once seen only to symbolize love, contemporary readers view passionate sex as a necessary part of a gratifying romantic relationship narrative. So viewed as such, erotically charged romance might be considered a mode of sex-positive feminism, whether as or with a human or a vampire. So the result of these three trends is that we have Austen vampire mashups as the literary culmination of two converging cultural trends. Romantic fictions turn to sex and the vampire fictions turn towards romance. It's likely a fleeting cultural convergence for the time being, or as I've mentioned, for a time that's already passed. But it is one I feel that reveals a great deal about the complex romantic challenges heterosexual women face in the early 21st century. Romantic and comic feelings abound in these mashups. Although they are Gothic romances, these mashups rarely indulge in feelings of terror and disgust. These mashups are obviously examples of what Catherine Spooner calls the happy Gothic. But tensions and fault lines still inevitably emerge. The implicit violence of being killed and revivified by a vampire, for instance, reveals itself through the cracks. When these mashups are read attentively, issues of sexual consent and subsequent trauma emerge to threaten and disrupt the comic and romantic veneer of these happy Gothic romances. This presents as an obstinate problem in this body of works. And it's one of the major reasons why I felt so compelled to read such so-called lowbrow literary productions with such critical care. So what follows then are three examples that exemplify how these mashups betray deep anxieties about love and sex and romance in the 21st century, about feminism or feminisms and modern womanhood, and also about Austen's place and value in 21st century literary and popular culture. And to do this, I'll be looking at the Austen heroine as a vampire slayer, Pride and Prejudice rewritten as a vampire romance, and Austen herself reimagined as a vampire. So there's your answer, Sam. Austen does qualify as a creature for today. Here are some of the examples. Just quickly, Emma and the Vampires, Mr. Darcy, Vampire, obviously a Pride and Prejudice spin-off. Jane and the Damned by Janet Maloney, where Jane Austen is reimagined as a Georgian vampire, and she's given a rather healthy sex life, if you like, in an alternate Georgian universe. And also Fanny Price gets a gig as a slayer too. But I want to start off with considering Austen's vampire slaying heroines. In 21st century culture, vampire slaying is often a feminine and feminist pursuit. The figure of the female vampire slayer in modern paranormal adaptations of classic literature owes a great deal, of course, to Joss Whedon's cult television series, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. With her blonde hair, petite frame, and stylish high school fashion, Buffy's physical attractiveness certainly privileges the male gaze, but these girly visual cues are subverted in Buffy by a new kind of heroine, one who occupies a role often reserved exclusively for men in popular culture. Though she is still a girl, as Bruce A. McClelland affirms in his study of the Slayer, Buffy acquires, through the phallic symbolism of the spike, a quasi-masculine status. Accordingly, she is revered by fans worldwide as a turn-of-the-century feminist icon. But Buffy the Vampire Slayer underlines vampire slaying as a lonely and essentially feminine experience. The opening narration of each episode reminds viewers that while Buffy's calling as a slayer is but one in a long tradition, it is a necessarily solitary one. And we might be familiar with this opening of the Buffy episodes. In every generation, there is a chosen one girl in all the world. She alone will stand against the vampires, the demons, and the forces of darkness. She is the Slayer. The loneliness of this vocation is emphasized too in the expanded Buffyverse spun out by graphic novels and TV spin-offs. So the life of the Slayer is depicted as a lonely and tortured vocation, and notably for our purposes, often devoid of romantic fulfillment. So as an urtext to paranormal Austen mashups, Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its attendant mythology bestows a significant feminine tension. The feminist ideal presented by the Buffyverse is one that cashes in on slaying as a low feminine experience, one that defies normative social conventions and gender stereotypes. Paranormal Austen mashups, though, trade in love and marriage, ultimately reinforcing the prescribed social conventions that slayers of the Buffyverse defy. The two positions aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but slayers of paranormal Austen romance are faced with a weighty dilemma: to kiss or to kill. This dilemma is played out in Colleen Gleason's novella, Northanger Castle, published in 2010, where we meet Carolyn Merrill, a stand-in for Austen's Catherine Morland. We first observe her in the crowded and unpleasantly warm pump room, clutching an unsuitably large bag. Her chaperone wrongly presumes that the bag is full of books, but instead it carries a variety of implements, including a palm-sized silver cross, a pair of scissors, a magnifying glass, and most cumbersomely, a large wooden stake. These are, of course, tools for detecting and killing vampires, and despite her better judgment, she longs to find one. But the problem is that despite her thorough knowledge of vampire literature and lore, she's unconsciously incompetent at picking out the vampire amongst the men of her society. She mistakes James Thornton, aka John Thorpe, as a romantic beau, but he is instead a vampire. She also mistakes Mr. Blanchard, a man she has been tracking, as a vampire when he is in fact a slayer, one who has actually been following Carolyn Merrill closely to protect her rather than harm her. When Carolyn is confronted by Mr. Blanchard, alone in the halls of a castle with a stake in pouch, she is faced with the choice. What kind of heroine does she want to be? A slayer or a romantic heroine? In this, her moment of truth, she fails as a slayer. She is rendered powerless by Mr. Blanchard's gaze and is unable to free her stake before he is upon her. Breathless, with heart racing, she braces for a sharp pain in the side of her neck, but instead felt the soft warmth of lips closing over hers. Gentle, tender, coaxing, she unthinkingly returns his kiss, submitting to her desire for more. Mr. Blanchard's kiss tells Carolyn unequivocally that he is Mr. Right. And yet, she still resists, dogged by the conventions of Gothic and vampire fiction, as opposed to being guided by those of romance. When Carolyn's stake falls between them, and Mr. Blanchard incredulously asks whether she suspects him to be a vampire, she regains her composure, determined not to be undone by a little passion. Reclaiming the stake and wielding her crucifix, she threatens to kill Mr. Blanchard. To this, he surrenders, offering his broad chest and adjusting the wooden stake in her hand to ensure a better grip. And he submissively advises, "There now, take a blow. right in the heart. Hastily assuring him that she knows exactly what to do and where the stake must go, as any self-professed slayer should, she wavers before meekly asking, "Is there not another way to prove whether or not you're a vampire?" Gleeson skillfully focalizes the crux of Caroline's dilemma by recognizing the centrality of the heart in both vampiric and romantic lore. Mr. Blanchard's heart is either the stilled core of his undead existence or the beating spring of his love for Caroline. Here, in this moment, Caroline must choose. It is at this point that she finally surrenders to a new heroic destiny, disarmed physically and emotionally by Mr. Blanchard's resignation to her will. The confirmation of Caroline's loving union with Mr. Blanchard is the novella's emotional payoff, ultimately proving Caroline as the heroine of a romantic story. The subsequent and only encounter between Slayer and Vampire in the novella, in which Vampire Thornton is vanquished by Mr. Blanchard, is over so quickly, in Caroline's own terms, it is rendered anticlimactic. It functions as a quasi-climax of the Gothic and vampire narratives that Caroline reads and therefore expects in her own life, but not as the denouement of her love story. Her self-determined destiny as a vampire slayer remains unfulfilled, but only for the time being. Mr. Blanchard implicitly promises to teach her the ways of the vampire hunter, won over by her natural courage, but this is a deferred prize enabled by the more immediate rewards of love and marriage. Thus, while the roles of vampire slayer and romantic heroine appear irreconcilable in Gleeson's novella, ending conventionally in romantic union rather than the post-feminist apotheosis of a vampire hunter, its conclusion does point to the possibility of Caroline's ongoing maturation towards a different kind of union, that of seemingly contrasting modes of femininity. Gleeson's Caroline Merrill is an example of how the heroines of Austen vampire mashups are often posed with the difficult task of negotiating what appears to be overlapping, but at times contradictory feminine pursuits, slaying, and romance. If vampire slaying is a distinctly assertive feminist action, and traditionalist heteronormative romance as reinforcing conservative values and gender roles, then how does an Austenian vampire-slaying heroine remain empowered as a slayer while seeking the romantic fulfillment that comes with happily ever after? Caroline is not ardently feminist in the same way as Buffy Summers might be, whose girly penchant for fashion, kick-ass attitude and skills, and commitment to individual and collective empowerment make her a modern third wave and post-feminist icon. But Caroline is post-feminist, nevertheless, a heroine who embodies what Angela McRobbie calls double entanglement, which comprises of, quote, the coexistence of neoconservative values in relation to gender, sexuality, and family life, with processes of liberalization in regard to choice and diversity in domestic, sexual, and kinship relations. Caroline exemplifies post-feminism as the ongoing transformation that looks to rework feminism in ways that often overlap, modify, or even contradict one another. Gleeson's Northanger Abbey points to Caroline's happy future as a budding slayer and wife, under the tutelage and loving care of her husband. She is not bound to sacrifice her slaying identity for romantic and domestic fulfillment. Her sword is not quieted by love, as is the case for Graham Smith's zombie-slaying Elizabeth Bennet. That is to say, her particular ideals of femininity are not conquered by love, but rather perfected by it. Next, I want to turn to Pride and Prejudice as vampire romance. Oh, that's my little bit of artwork there. I struggled to find a picture of Darcy as a vampire, so I had to make one. Unfortunately, didn't quite cut it for the book cover, but anyway. So, Trouble in Paradise, Pride and Prejudice as vampire romance. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is, of course, one of the most loved romances in English literature. So if vampires are to be seen as ciphers for the fears and anxieties of any given age, then Austen's Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet are likewise often appropriated as vessels for our views of ideal romance, whether they be unchanging in the face of modernizing cultural forces or transformed to reflect evolving gender and sexual politics. So, when Pride and Prejudice is retold as a vampire romance, then it is a creative collision that forces us to reassess the ideals and associated anxieties of modern love and desire. The introduction of vampires into the venerated romance of Pride and Prejudice is an experiment first seen in Stephenie Meyer's Twilight. Meyer, an avowed Austen reader, has widely acknowledged Pride and Prejudice as an inspiration for her teenage romance between Edward Cullen and Bella Swan. Their relationship has become a lightning rod for feminist debate. Meyer's reimagining of the vampire into a masochistic object of teen romantic desire can be viewed as the fulfillment of a female sexual fantasy. And Edward Cullen muses on this very reversal of power when he says, "And so the lion fell in love with the lamb. What a sick, masochistic lion." The Byronic lineage that links Austen's Darcy with Meyer's Edward Cullen is well established, and we don't need to think too hard about their common literary ancestry here. But reimagining Darcy as a new, emotionally accessible vampire opens new horizons for lovers of Austen and romance. The convergence of these two literary cults appears to focalize what modern readers value in both Austen and the vampire tradition: undying love and desire. Together they promise an eternal love of a different sort, not one that endures death and persists into an incorporeal afterlife, but one that can be enjoyed physically forever. The merging of Austen's greatest romantic hero, Mr. Darcy, with the new vampire promises to produce the modern ideal of the romantic lover: handsome, virile, protective, noble, affluent, forever young, yet wise with experience, and most notably, immortal. As one blogger exclaimed in anticipation of Granger's Mr. Darcy vampire in 2009, "Mr. Darcy is a vampire? I am so there." But what happens if vampire Darcy can't quite remove himself from the sadistic and fiendish origins of the literary vampire? This is a permutation that I argue emerges in Colette L. Saucier's erotic novels, Pulse and Prejudice and Dearest Bloody Elizabeth. The first of these adaptations follows Austen's original plot, told in third-person narration, focalized through Darcy's perspective. As a result, Darcy's noble struggle is brought to the surface of the narrative. He is acutely aware of his vampiric frailties and tormented by his mostly unavailing desire to rise above them. And his honourable resolution never to wed, lest he should put a lover in harm's way, is sorely tested when by his growing desire for Elizabeth Bennet. Throughout the novel, Darcy is resolved to live as a civilized man and to refrain from using his supernatural powers of persuasion. In the meantime, we witness his archenemy Wickham indulge in his every vampiric desire, in which his vampiric assaults begin to resemble the dynamics of rape, and his ability to glamour his victims as the silencing of testimony. This slippage between the literal and figurative comes home to roost in the novel's final erotic volume, detailing the premarital beginnings of Darcy and Elizabeth's sex life. The first of their sexual encounters is restricted to a bite, but the parallels between dental and sexual penetration are evident. As Elizabeth feels Darcy penetrating her flesh, a flood of delirium pours over her, at once paralyzed and wanting to pull him deeper into her. Soon, she voraciously kisses his blood-stained mouth, her lips, quote, swollen and smeared with blood, her own blood. Later in the volume, Darcy feels remorseful, ashamed that their first kiss descended into what he calls such savagery. Elizabeth gives him the opportunity to replay the kiss as he would have preferred, with tenderness. But to this, she responds with a frown, declaring, "I believe I preferred savagery." If the ideal romantic fantasy is to tame the beast with love, then Elizabeth doesn't want to tame the beast entirely. Passion ensues, and this time, Darcy's bite literally coincides with sex, the sweet metallic taste of blood, her blood, on both their lips. A taste she comes to find exquisitely erotic. Elizabeth here resembles the young Anastasia of E.L. James's 50 Shades of Grey, itself a fanfic response to Twilight, who also tastes the faint metallic tang of her own hymeneal blood during her first sexual encounter. A question that arises then is, which Darcy is Elizabeth's ideal lover? The man, the monster, or indeed both? It would appear that Elizabeth's masochistic desires can only be satisfied by a combination of man and monster, Darcy the upstanding man of society, and the demon in the sack. That marrying such a model of hyper-masculinity carries great risk, as the image of Elizabeth with swollen and bloodied lips might suggest. Removed from this context, this is an image of domestic violence rather than sexual pleasure. It is also somewhat redolent of Bella Swan's bruised body after her first sexual encounter with Edward in Maya's Breaking Dawn, a violence that Bella figures as ecstasy. Elizabeth's bloodied face and Bella's battered body exemplify Durham's contention that vampiric lust is inherently violent, and the two cannot be unyoked. Later still, in the novel, after days of separation, Darcy is resolved to take Elizabeth, body and blood, all restraint disturbingly dissolved to the point that, quote, had she not invited him in, he would have taken her still. This is no longer a metaphor. The threat of rape is real. Despite his noble ambition, Darcy is unable to separate man from monster. And while Saucier's Darcy may well be presented as a perfect combination of rectitude, restraint, and passion, the malevolent and deep-seated literary roots of the vampire as a sexual fiend evidently cannot be entirely concealed. The risk of violent abuse remains ever present, a latent, unpredictable threat to contented, eternal love. The third-person narrative of Saucier's second volume, Dearest, Bloodiest Elizabeth, is more frequently focalized through Elizabeth's perspective as she grapples with her complicated marriage. In a sense, Saucier's Elizabeth is a romantic pioneer, living at the vanguard of romantic period vampirology and staking her life on being able to achieve romantic fulfillment with a creature that had hitherto been seen only as a ghoulish monster. The realization of both risk and reward in marrying Vampire Darcy is made abundantly clear in the early pages of the sequel, which revels in the daring sexual play of newlyweds. Chasing his wife on snowy ground through the hedge maze at Pemberley, Darcy catches, kisses, bites, and drinks from Elizabeth. An erotic sensation the moaning Elizabeth relishes. For Elizabeth, and for those who fantasize to be like her, this is the preternatural sexual reward for taming a vampire in matrimony. The accompanying symbolic imagery, however, of crimson blood falling on virginal white snow ominously portends corruption and death. As Elizabeth's sexual appetite, continues unabated, she also increasingly suffers from moments of faintness. She interprets these symptoms as possible pregnancy. Instead, it becomes increasingly clear that Elizabeth suffers from a lack of blood, and that Darcy's playful love bites endanger Elizabeth's life. In an ironic twist, what Elizabeth thought and feared was the beginning of a new life, because she didn't want to be a mother so soon, is in fact the approaching end of her own. Eventually, after torments and trials that test their marriage, Elizabeth does fall pregnant. But Well, to cut a long story short, she's murdered by vengeful Wickham, threatened by the impending birth of a powerful Dampier, that is, a half human and half vampire, who, according to vampire lore, are said to have special vampire slaying abilities. So, threatened by uh, this imminent child of Darcy's and Elizabeth's, Wickham double crosses Elizabeth and Darcy and finds an opportunity to slash Elizabeth's throat at the behest of his new vampire society. To save his wife, Darcy feeds from her before leaving her to heal in the moonlight. Out of necessity, Elizabeth is transformed into a vampire, unconsciously bequeathing her humanity to her children, twins, during childbirth. Note the resemblance to Bella's conversion during childbirth in Breaking Dawn, too. But unlike Saucier's Elizabeth, Stephenie Meyer's Bella had long pined for the supernatural control that vampiric transformation offers and relishes her newborn's superhuman strength and immortality. Upon waking, Saucier's Elizabeth is distraught, with fears of being a wicked wife now replaced by that of being a monstrous mother. Elizabeth rejects her new vampiric nature and her Dampier children, and instead yearns for death. She is healed, however, at the first touch of her daughter's hand, her heart full and redeemed by a new kind of love, maternal love. In risking marriage to a vampire and pursuing a heady mix of supernatural eroticism and romantic fulfillment, Elizabeth seems to have attained the dreamy ideal of eternally constant love, thrilling sex, a new family, and a home brimming with love. The realization of this Faustian romantic fantasy comes at a considerable cost. She has, without consent or agency, lost her humanity, or, as some would have it, her soul. Just as Saucier's first novel, Pulse and Prejudice, presents Mr. Darcy as an alluring Byronic combination of passion and dignity, but a romantic hero unable to completely shake off the sexually fiendish aspects of his vampiric nature, Saucier's sequel, Dearest Bloodiest Elizabeth, leaves Austen's greatest romantic heroine to an imperfect fate as a reluctant vampire. In pursuing her romantic dream, she has learned that loving vampire Darcy is not without unwanted and often difficult concessions. It is a romantic payoff that Saucier's novels seem to vividly mark with Elizabeth's blood, and one that reveals the fine line between dreamboats and nightmares. So now I want to turn to an example of Jane Austen herself as a vampire. So on one hand, this reimagining can be read to give corporeal form to Austen's undying fame. On the other hand, the vampiric incarnation of Austen can also betray deep anxieties about her place in 21st century literature and popular culture. Coupled with such anxieties are concerns about the contemporary commodification of her image and works. Austen's novels are art, capital L literature. They owe their endurance to their artistic merit, not to the vulgar influences of marketing, branding, and profits, or to the proliferating number of products that invoke her name that seem to have an increasingly tenuous connection to her novels. Or so the argument goes. This is precisely the set of concerns Michael Thomas Ford cleverly plays with in his series of Austen vampire mashups, beginning with Jane Bites Back in 2011. Ford relocates Austen as an undead misfit living in upstate New York, going by the name of Jane Fairfax. And his novels revel in the triangular comic tension between Austen the author, her uneasy immortality, and the consumerist culture that surrounds her. Ford's Jane did not die in 1817. This was just a fake death to cover up her conversion into a vampire by Lord Byron, leaving her old life behind. Yes, Byron gets plenty of action. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Leaving her old life behind, including her publisher, John Murray, Jane has been struggling to publish her next novel ever since. This Austen must bear witness to her posthumous literary fame, sometimes for better, but mostly for worse. She is an immortal artist alienated from her own legacy. Living in the new millennium, she disavows her vampiric state for traumatic reasons, which I won't go into, is busy as the owner of a successful bookstore, drives a beat-up Volvo, and lives alone with her cat. All conventional signs that her life needs an injection of romance. Overall, it is a comic portrayal of a very real concern for Austen fans. What would Jane Austen think of her modern legacy and her contemporary status as a pop culture icon? From the outset, aspects of Jane's own popular legacy are presented as obstacles to her contemporary artistic success. The first problem that Jane must contend with is the prevailing image of Austen and her novels as conservative. This might include perceptions of the author and the scope and style of her novels as sheltered, orderly, demure, and morally orthodox. Byron torments Jane with his popular perception when he returns to her to disrupt her life in the 21st century. And it is a jibe that really gets under her skin. Jane is confronted with this perception by others too. Late in the first novel, her publisher, Kelly, is surprised to learn that Jane has a boyfriend and by implication might actually also enjoy a sex life. Don't take it the wrong way. It's just that you seem so, I don't know, proper, I guess. Jane silently bristles at such similar misconceptions of her works. Skipping over a fun side plot involving a manic and undead Charlotte Bronte who is burnt alive, or should that be burnt undead, like her own Bertha Mason? I want to draw attention to the way Ford's novel self-reflexively zeroes in on an attendant anxiety about Austen's contemporary legacy, the fusion of Austenian and Byronic romance. And this is where you might say the subtitle of tonight's presentation, Lady and the Vamp, comes into play. After Jane finally finds fame, she's paired with Byron, who appears under a nom de plume at a romance writers convention in New Orleans. Jane is miffed. This event was meant to mark her return to the literary limelight, but instead the crown fawns over Byron, whipped into a frenzy by his natural charisma and his supernatural powers. The panel chair at this convention offers Byron the first opportunity to speak by asking him what he thinks women want, to which he obsequiously sprouts empty platitudes, declaring his love for women, for listening to women, and for giving voice to their feelings. Jane, unimpressed, presses Byron for a more substantial answer, to which he replies after an uneasy pause. What women want is to be accepted for who they are, not what the media tells them they should be, but who they really are. As the audience enthusiastically applauds, Jane loudly interjects, "Yet your books don't really depict women as they are, do they? Do you really mean for us to believe that you aren't just as guilty of presenting women with an idealized version of themselves?" Byron retorts, "I think we can all agree that fiction, particularly romantic fiction, works best when it contains some elements of fantasy. After all, a world of laundry, carpool, and helping with homework is hardly the setting for romance, do you think?" Without hesitation, and before the impatient MC moves discussion along, Jane affirms, "I absolutely do. Some of the most romantic novels in the world feature perfectly ordinary women." In this heated discussion, Jane draws an explicit distinction between the impossible fantasies of Byronic romance, as indeed found in Austen vampire mashups such as Colette Sorciers that we were discussing a moment ago, and the everyday magic of love. For Jane, real love is the ultimate romantic fantasy, a love that resides in the ordinary world, attainable as it is constant. Jane advocates for a love grounded in realism, or for Austenian romance. Implicit in Jane's criticism and Ford's scenario also is the question of whether such Byronic fantasies privilege male or female desire. After all, it is the vampire Byron, exerting his supernatural influence, who tells the women of the audience what it is they want. The shared desire for women to be more than their ordinary selves is the imaginary space where Byronic romantic fantasy thrives, but perhaps not a healthy space for either sex to dwell. For Jane, only a love grounded in the ordinary delights of reality is fit for a life lived happily ever after. Jane is forced to witness and reckon with the modern proliferation of her literary legacy. The multiplying significances attached to her name are reflected by Jane's constant battle to redefine her artistic identity against prevailing misconceptions. In Jane Bites Back, Jane contends that her novels are not prim, nor merely romantic. The novel also draws attention to the literary mashup as arguably one of the many opportunistic, avaricious, creative, and commercial practices, as a microcosmic rendition of Karl Marx's famous critique of capitalism as vampire-like, living only by sucking living labour. Ford's Jane is subject to a greater vampiric force in his novels, a rampant Austen industry that exploits the accrued dead labours of Austen, the novelist, and her readers, and whose primary objective is not the accumulation of cultural capital, but of economic capital. Or, in short, Jane might be the vampire here, but she is really the one being sucked dry. The title of the novel, Jane Bites Back, takes on a new resonance in this context. But as the novel suggests, Austen's artistic legacy is not fixed, but is both flexible and robust enough to adapt to and withstand the forces of modernity and globalism. She can be countless Austens for many, an Austen multiverse, if you will, even if Ford's Jane is not entirely happy with all of them. But as the most self-referential of all the mashups considered in this study, Ford's Jane is decidedly anti-Byronic, and by extension, playfully renounces the very Austen vampire mashup of which it is part. So, to some concluding thoughts. Well, I hope these examples offer a sample of the ways in which these seemingly lowbrow and amateur productions reward close critical reading. At the time of writing, it seemed to me that Austen vampire mashups had typically been considered as cultural artifacts, presented in studies as cultural curiosities, as if displayed in glass cabinets in a virtual museum of contemporary culture. This was my attempt to reach in and to break the glass. I wanted to see what insights could be gained from treating these mashups with careful attention, remaining alert to their symbology, their shared lexicon, their intertextuality, their self-reflexivity, and to what they readily profess and what they inadvertently reveal. To highlight Juliet Wells's important claim, we have a lot to learn from listening to everyday readers explain in their own words how they use Austen's writings and what Austen means to them. The Austen vampire mashup is a multifaceted literary nexus that has implications for both Austen and the vampire in the 21st century. The mashups, both directly and indirectly, speak to the multiplicity of Austen's legacy in contemporary times, a quality celebrated by some and the cause of anxiety for others. They also attest to the endurance of Austen's novels, and especially her heroines. Independent of mind, full of quiet passion, and prone to the errors of youth, they are equally timeless as they are amenable to reimagining. Similarly, these mashups variously seek to renovate or reaffirm Austenian values, whatever they may be, for any given fan of any given age. Conversely, it is clear what vampires signify in this heady literary cocktail: sex and more of it. The inclusion of erotic pleasure in modern romantic ideals provides a clear context for the vampire's pairing with Austenian romance, especially considering vampire fiction's own contemporary turn to romance. As these Austen vampire mashups reveal, however, it is not always easy to bring the libidinous vampire to heel. As villains and fiends, they are easily spurned. As assimilated lovers, they present a riskier proposition. Most often, though, their potency as symbols of paranormal Byronic eroticism is muted by and subsumed with a decidedly ordinary human paradigm of confluent love. Stripped of their threatening monstrosity, they represent, as Crawford suggests, a fantasy of difference without difference. For all its imaginative variety and diverging ideals, the Austen vampire mashup is a curious, confusing beast. This is, of course, precisely the function of romance. As Catherine Roach attests, romance is an imaginative resource to the conundrum of living as a woman in a man's world, to offer a fantasy-safe space for thinking through the conundrum and for feeling its contours differently. Variety, then, it would appear, is a laudable virtue. And confusion, too, might be just as appropriate. Thank you, everyone. Before I hand over back to Sam, let me be gratuitous and take this opportunity to also plug my other recent book, Graveyard Gothic, co-edited with David McAllister and Zoe Aldana Reyes, which is about, I guess, the graveyard as a Gothic locale from 18th century poetry through to 21st century Japanese video games. But enough of that. Thanks for coming along and listening to me speak about Austen and vampires.